So is the camera going to be good? Can we tilt it up a little bit? Is that better? So I've got one white shoe I'm going to put in front here. For those of you at home can see it, maybe one white. This one happens to be autographed by John Lennon, of course. Sort of, anyway. So lately, I have read some interesting opinions on how people's minds are changed, or if people's minds can be changed at all. One idea is this, and I'm not saying you have to agree with this. This is just an idea that I recently read. Neurological differences affect the way people think about family, about politics, about inclusiveness or exclusiveness. Each person's brain is different, and those differences actually predict then a person's political disposition even more than the family in which they grew up. In those situations, all the talking and all the arguing in the world means nothing. Almost no one is going to change their mind because they can't change their mind. Sort of like being an introvert or an extrovert. You are who you are because you were born that way. Now that's one idea. Here's another one. In a recent article in Salon, Amanda Marcotte suggests that some of us are fixated on a fantasy that someone running, for example, for office will magically break this reverie of certain people, meaning those with whom we disagree, by deprogramming them on the spot by saying something. Which means someone out there will be able to, like you or me or somebody else, will be able to change people's minds simply by saying something, by making an argument, so that we can then get back to what we might want to consider to be normal, whatever that might be. That's another idea. Here's another one. David Brooks recently wrote in the New York Times that our main problem right now is our national psychology. He points out that Americans' satisfaction with their personal lives is nearly 4 times higher as their satisfaction with the state of the nation. So we are happy personally, but we're unhappy as a nation. So he asked the question, why? And his explanation was this, and that's likely because during the Trump era in which we still exist, we have suffered a collective moral injury, a collective loss of confidence, and a loss of faith in ourselves and in each other as a nation. All right? And that's probably not news to most of you, but it's an interesting way to think about it. And he went further to say that we have lived through 2 recent periods of national demoralization. During Vietnam and Watergate, America lost faith in our institutions. And he claims that during the Trump era, Americans have lost faith in one another. It's an interesting argument. He goes on a little further to say that anthropologist Raoul Naral argued that every society has what is called a moral net, a cultural infrastructure that exists mostly unconsciously in the minds of our members, our neighbors, our families. And he claims that America's moral net right now is in tatters that manifests itself as a loss of national self-esteem. And David Brooks points out that you can't argue people out of their psychological and moral state with statistics and fact sheets. What we need, he says, is a 21st century national story that gives people a sense of coherence and belonging, in which we are than together marching in a clear direction towards some concrete set of goals. As I thought about these, I thought, well, many times in our past, religion or a religious person stepped in to address this crisis, and we were then able to both see ourselves as we are and also to see perhaps a way out of a morass or a lack of a moral net, perhaps, if you like that image. And it makes me think that one person that we still look to, but we often have to wade through a lot to get to him, is Jesus. And I'm not saying you have to believe in Jesus. I'm saying that's one person, one example that we still look to who did this. Some of the wading through to get to Jesus involves reading different translations of the New Testament, because that's one of the few things that we have as a way to get at Jesus. So I'm going to give you some examples. For example, in Pastor Eugene Peterson's translation called The Message, Jesus says in Matthew 10:39, and I'm going to put it on the screen for you to read through with me here, or Davey's going to put it up there. This is Eugene Peterson's translation. If your first concern is to look after yourself, you'll never find yourself. But if you forget about yourself and look to me, you'll find both yourself and me. The more traditional interpretation from which Eugene Peterson was working says, those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. You've probably all heard that before. Well, life is full of distractions that keep us from doing just that, finding ourselves. And as if you've been listening to Carol Grafford, or if you know some things about Buddhism and yourself, that's very clear within Buddhist teaching. For followers of Jesus, one possible large distraction is thinking that looking to Jesus means looking only to Jesus and assuming it's all about him and going through him, that you somehow have to believe in him through this lens that we are given of Christianity. You have to believe in Jesus to find yourself or salvation. That's one teaching within Christianity, and I would call it vicarious atonement, meaning Jesus does it all for us. But not all Christians believe the same way, including that particular teaching. But one could argue that the different ways people understand Jesus can be true for them and can actually work for them. But the danger is objectification, making it vicarious, putting it all on someone or someone else other than me, or putting it all on something. That kind of objectification has a cost. When it removes what is obtainable from our midst, and that's obviously making the claim that what is obtainable in our midst, or removing it from within ourselves, which happens also to be a Buddhist teaching and a practice that Carol talked about a week or two ago. So this morning I would like to look through the lens of the ordinary being the divine, and you can go ahead and put up that third screenshot, Davey. I'd like to look again through the lens of the ordinary being the divine, and I am defining the word divine here as being of God and not God, and the divine, or that which is of God or sacred, being found in the ordinary. So just digest that for a second if you can. Jesus' teaching of finding oneself by forgetting one's self comes in Matthew in a long discourse, very long discourse of instructions, do's and don'ts, about how to live in community from a religious perspective. And keep in mind, in Jesus' time, there was no real separation between religion and community, between what we would call church and state. That separation was imposed upon everyone, including Jesus, by a different way of looking at things, that by people, in his case, that happened to be Romans, non-Jewish people. People were dazed and confused, which, if you caught it, is the Led Zeppelin connection back from the first screenshot that was up there. What's the connection between Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and a cup of cool water? There, I gave it to you. People were dazed and confused in Jesus' day, and worse, their lives were threatened. If you are feeling dazed and confused today, if you are feeling dazed and confused these days, you are in good company, because we're all that way to a certain extent. Looking inside ourselves at the problems and at the solutions is a good place to start. Jesus' teaching then becomes very relevant here, and that the teaching is this: if your first concern is to look after yourself, you'll never find yourself. Stated differently, the first step then is to take a step back from ourselves and realizing it's not all about me. Now, when I think of that comment, I think of a great movie, Field of Dreams, in which Kevin Costner is in a tizzy and he says, "What's in it for me? What's in it for me?" he says 2 times. That should not be our question today. It was great in the film, but it's not our question. Today's culture wars seem to be about defending my cause while everybody else is defending their cause. We're all doing the same thing. When everyone is protecting their vested interests, then it becomes me versus everyone else, or us when we identify people that think like us versus them, people that don't think like us. And today, no minds are changed by arguing or by active conflict with one another. When that happens, we end up needing to understand what Gandhi meant when he said, "An eye for an eye leaves everyone blind." But I have to ask, I think we still do ask, what is my life about? If it's not about me. I mean, come on. What is your life about if it's not about you? Well, I have a confession to make. My wife says I have a thing about shoes. Well, I do have a thing about shoes. I do have a lot of Converse All-Stars, at least I will say that. That's not my confession, okay? I don't think that's the problem. I happen to have a pair of Converse All-Stars for every season of the church year, plus some other occasions. This is my confession, all right? I'm outing myself. In 1977, I was walking down the hill behind the campus at St. Olaf College toward my apartment, and I saw underneath the tree a pair of white Converse All-Stars. This is not the same shoe, by the way. But I saw a pair of Converse All-Stars just sitting there underneath this tree. So I looked around. No barefooted person to be seen. So I sat down and I waited a little bit. No one appeared. So I took my old tennis shoes off, put the cons on, and walked away. Fair trade? Well, later that year, I happened to learn whose shoes they were. And luckily, we had a good laugh about it. And I'll get to the point a little bit later, so just leave that in your mind. If we are willing to admit that it's not all about me, as it's not all about what's in my own ego and what I'm protecting, how do we learn a proper place for our own ego that makes room for someone else's perspective. The question being, how do we get comfortable walking in someone else's shoes? And how do we walk in someone else's shoes without stealing them? And that's a great concern when I think about it, and this was not in my thoughts that I prepared for this morning, but that happens so very often when we go out of our way to try to learn about another culture, and then we bend over backwards to bring people to us, to talk to us about their own way of thinking and being and doing things, and we re-traumatize them. Boarding schools is a good example of that. So how do we walk in someone else's shoes without stealing them, respecting what other people's shoes are and not putting them on, thinking that we can be them? That's a sideline. Many of the great religions of the world tell us that it's not just about me. Most of them do. They teach it's about me in relation to God, or that which is divine, or that which is sacred, and me then in relation to us. Seen then in a certain interpretation or a lens, even Judaism and Christianity would say that personal salvation is about wholeness in the context of our Creator and creation and our neighbors, whomever those neighbors happen to be. So here's an interesting thought. In the same long set of teachings in Matthew's gospel, Jesus warns that he came to bring a sword of division. I'm assuming most of you have heard that line. Jesus comes to bring a sword. Now that is a passage that's easy to weaponize. Probably the most common word in the English language right now is weaponize. That teaching we have weaponized, and we use it against our neighbors and our families and our communities. My understanding, through a different lens of Christianity, is that Jesus is saying the things that divide are being cut away. If Jesus is wielding a sword, it's to cut away the things that divide us. Because what follows Jesus saying that is that we are to give a cup of cool water to one of these little ones. That's not a very sword-like, dividing-like statement. So in the Message, Eugene Peterson translates that particular verse to say, "This is a large work that I have called you into. But don't be overwhelmed by it. It's best to start small. Give a cup of cool water to someone who is thirsty. The smallest act of giving or receiving makes you a true apprentice. And whoever gives even a cup of cool water to one of these little ones." Now, you could think of an innocent child as one of these little ones, and you would be partly right. But in today's world, then we are challenged also to identify who are some of the other little ones. Who else are the vulnerable ones in our world? And one could also then conclude, well, all categories of the lost and the least is also a common phrase in the New Testament, including then expanding our minds to all non-human creations, like the world around us, are vulnerable. But who else is vulnerable today? And this would be one of the hardest ones to admit. Some of those vulnerable ones are the ones with the hardest exteriors. Those whose minds are inflexible and cannot change. those who don't seem to be able to see from another perspective. And that likely includes us. I know it includes me, and I got the rocks up here, so you can't throw them at me, but I think that includes all of us. The challenge is this from Jesus: you give them a cup of cool water. That gets hard. A paraphrase of something the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 6 would be this: don't give your old ways of doing things the time of day. You have been saved. Throw yourselves into that. Do all you do with that in your mind and in your heart. You are free to do the right thing. You are free to do the good thing. So do that. It's nice to take Paul and make him into something positive now and then. Though we cannot change everyone's mind, and maybe we can't change anyone's mind if we're honest and we agree with some of those opinions I read earlier, there's still part of me that would like to say we must hope that we can change at least our own little place of our own little piece of the world right where we are, right where I am. That by small steps we can change ourselves. At least I can change myself. I have to hang on to that kind of hope. We can be healed of our personal dis-ease, and we can live differently. And that might be potentially how we impact then our family, our congregation, our neighborhood, our community, by taking that small, sometimes very difficult step. Paul then goes on to clarify in Romans 6, you are free to live differently. You are free to live creatively. Freedom is the common good. And while and you can say the same thing, while I may be free to do what I want, according to Paul himself, what I think many don't realize is even within the Jewish Christian understanding, the I needs to be understood within the context of the we, or the us. In Buddhist thinking, the I is a construct and doesn't really exist. In Confucian thinking, the I is always in relation to the we. In Zulu, it is expressed in the word Ubuntu, which is translated as humanity, or I am because we are. There's other translations, I'm sure, that examples that you could throw in here. Humanity then becomes a balance between the I and the we. And that's where the Beatles got it right. I am he as you are she, I'll change that, as you are me, and we are all together. Cuckoo-ca-choo. So the last screenshot here is when we are overwhelmed by the enormity of the large work that we are called into. It's best to start small. Give a cup of cool water to someone, anyone who is thirsty, including those with whom you disagree, or have nothing in common but your humanity. It is in such actions the ordinary becomes the divine. And then, walking in someone else's shoes might be much more possible. But ask permission first.